One most significant piece of information is he's married to Rachel, and they do collaborate, and they're working on a book together right now about the postal history of internment, and Alan will tell us more about that in his talk. Alan's an independent researcher who's been looking into the experiences of the German and Austrian refugees interned by the British during World War II. He was initially inspired as to research into his father's experiences as an internee, and I don't know the details about this. He also refers to Denora Boy. So he spent many years delving deep into all aspects of that internment saga. Alan is a chartered accountant and an entrepreneur, but he has special interest in the postal and banking systems of the camps, has investigated the banknotes and scripts created by the internees while they were in the camps. And he and his wife will be publishing about this research. So let me turn it over now to Alan, and take it away, please. And then we'll have questions. Put questions into the chat, and then we'll entertain those questions after Alan's presentation. So thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Tony. Good evening, everybody, or whatever time of day it is with you. As Tony said, and thank you very much for the introduction, my father was interned initially in the United Kingdom and then deported to Australia on the Dunera. But I'm not going to talk so much about his experiences, but it will correspond with other people's. And I'm inspired to talk about the postal history, because the letters and the envelopes show so much that of untold stories that you can tell from the cover, and then when you dig deeper into these things, the stories are quite fascinating. So I'm going to give a very quick canter through a few examples of the sort of experiences you can witness through the postal history. I'm going to just start sharing my screen. Oops. There we go. So, oh, that's not, it's better. So hopefully everybody can see that. And this first slide, oops, that I've done to show that there are two types of ways to look at postal history. On the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see the book, The Isle of Man Postal History of 20th Century Internment Mail, which is an extraordinarily good book and will give you a good overview of some of the camps on the Isle of Man. But the view it takes of the mail is to concentrate on the postal marks and the cachets and the different types of frankings that the different camps put on them. And that's what the stamp collectors and the cover collectors look for. They look for all the different types of marks that they can get so that they can collect. Whereas that really doesn't give the full story of who these people were, why they were there, when they were there, and who they were. So on the other side of the screen is one of Tony's father's letters to his mother from internment. So Tony's father was in Morag internment camp on the Isle of Man, and his wife was in Russian camp in Port Erin, and he produced these wonderful illustrated covers, which I'm sure any cover collector would give their eye teeth for. But the real interest from my point of view is what's written in the letters, which talks about how they strive to get released, or at some points in their case, whether they could actually get together into the married camp. But I'm not going to speak a huge amount on Tony's parents on this occasion. So this screen now shows you just the way I look at the two ways of looking at a different envelope. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you've got the who, when, where, and why. So you can see that the letter was being addressed to Heinz Bing when it was posted on the 13th of July 1940 in Hampstead, and it was posted to the aliens internment camp in Huyton in Liverpool. But also you notice that it's been forwarded so that there is also a Q in red, and there is also a Canadian census mark. So from that we can deduce that Heinz Bing had left Huyton and been sent to Canada for internment. And I'm fairly sure that he was then sent on the SS Ettrick to Canada, where he was interned. Now, that gives me enough information to be able to go and look up Heinz Bing's records, his internment records in the Home Office files at Kew, which can be done through ancestry.com and Find My Past, but also various other places. There are some archives in Canada, not many of which are actually online, but one can actually gain more information about Heinz Bing and understand why he was interned. From a postal cover collector's point of view, they're rather more interested in the fact that if you look at the green parts, there's a standard postmark, the UK census postmark, the Canadian census postmark, and on this case, a rather unusual excess to pay postmark. But that's the two ways of looking at different postal marks. So I'm now going to go on and I'm going to look at this envelope and tell a little story about Wolfgang Kittel. Now, this envelope is actually addressed to Swanwick camp in Derby, which is one that probably not many of this group will have heard of, because it actually related to, was a camp that the pro-Nazis were interned in this camp. He had originally been interned in Seaton. He'd actually been arrested in West Africa, in British Gambia, and he was then sent to the UK and interned. And he was actually the German consul to British Gambia. So he was actually, in theory, had diplomatic status, and that affected. And this was obviously then redirected because he wasn't in Swanwick anymore. And one can tell from this cover that it actually ended up in Australia. It says it received and opened in Melbourne. It says unknown in Australia, return to sender. Because he was very unusual in that, as I say, this slide shows that he was at Warner's Holiday Camp in Seaton, then Swanwick House in Derby. He then got sent on the Arandora Star to be sent to Canada. That was torpedoed and he was rescued from that and was promptly then put on the Tatura to be shipped out to Australia. However, the British government realised that they shouldn't have been deporting people with diplomatic status overseas. And very little is known about this, but he was actually disembarked at Cape Town, and somehow he was returned to the United Kingdom. And in his case, when one digs into the records, one finds that he was actually interned on the Isle of Man in Dunluce House. Now, this is a camp that, it's not really a camp, it's a country house. And this country house was one that was designed for diplomats and VIPs, where they were looked after in a certain amount of comfort. That was to make sure that any British diplomats who were interned by the Germans would get similar status and similar treatment. And in this picture, you actually see the family of the gentleman in the middle sitting down is Werner Gerlach, and he was the consul in Iceland. And when the British invaded Iceland, he was interned with his family. And originally, I believe he was sent to internment in the Tower of London before they organised Dunluce House on the Isle of Man. So that's something that by finding that envelope, which was actually part of a large auction of covers of a collector called Neil Russell that were auctioned in Australia a couple of years ago. But by investigating that cover, one uncovers a story that is going to be unusual to most people looking at internment. So the next story I'm going to show you is again a very unlikely story, or it's as almost all tales of internment are. Everybody has a different story to tell, but some of them have amazing twists and turns. So this letter is from Hannah Sulzbacher to her husband Martin Sulzbacher, who again is interned in Australia. So he was sent on the Tatura along with my father, this cover appeared on eBay a couple of years ago, and I decided that I would investigate both Hannah and Martin to see whether I could actually understand the story. And with a great deal of digging and a little bit of luck, we came across their grandson, David Sulzbacher, and we tracked him down, and Rachel and I went to visit him, and we were privileged that they shared the rest of their collection of covers to and from internment. It tells a very fascinating tale with a great deal of tragedy involved in it as well. But a little bit like Kittle, he started out being interned in Seaton in Devon, but he'd been sent before a tribunal and had been allocated as Category A because he was a well-to-do banker in Germany, and he had managed to extract most of his money and his wealth out of Germany and was helping others to do the same. Unfortunately, on one occasion when he was organising money to be smuggled out of Germany, the Nazi authorities discovered the cook on board the ship and the money belonging to a distant relative was confiscated. And unfortunately, this relative bore a grudge against Martin Sulzbacher and wrote a letter to the chair of the tribunal saying that Martin Sulzbacher was should repay him his lost money. Obviously, it wasn't Martin's fault that the money had gone missing, and he refused to do so. But the chairman of the tribunal took rather a dim view of the fact that Martin Sulzbacher was actually smuggling money out of Germany because it was against German law and he shouldn't have done it. So he interned him. And at the same time, he allocated his wife into category B. So Martin Sulzbacher was interned in February 1940 and was then boarded on the Arandora Star to go to Canada. Again, was lucky enough to be rescued and was put on the Dunera to go to Australia. In Australia, he spent time in 3 camps, Tatura camps 2, 3 and 4, and was repatriated to the UK to be reinterned on the Isle of Man. Meanwhile, his wife Hannah, spoiling the surprise there. His wife Hannah was in WWII Hotel in Port Erin, and you can see the letter at the top there. The 2 letters are one to her husband and one to somebody else, a friend who looked after their affairs outside of internment. And you can see the stamp clearly says Women's Internment Camp and WWII Hotel, and that's a picture of the big hotel where several hundred of the female internees were housed. But with her, at various times, were either 2 or 4 of her children who were also interned. 2 at various times were at boarding school. However, the other 2 were interned with her at WWII Hotel. However, there was great tragedy because the house that they were living in Hackney in North London was obliterated one night in the Blitz. And so they can quite safely say that internment saved them from almost certain death because the house was destroyed along with Martin Sulzbacher's parents, a brother, brother-in-law and sister. So 5 of them sadly died in the Blitz, and his house was destroyed. Now, when Martin Sulzbacher had come from Germany, he had brought with him his fortune, or a lot of his fortune, in gold coins. And these were put into a bank vault in London. But his brother, while he was interned, got very worried that if there was an invasion by the Nazis, they would get to the banks and they would confiscate any gold that was within the vaults. So he removed the gold from the vaults and buried it in the garden of their house. And the only people who actually knew where this gold was buried were the 5 people who were living in the house at the time. And of course, they all died in the air raid. So that's a picture of Martin Sulzbacher. And then some years after the war, when Martin had been released from internment, he went to the site to try and see whether he could uncover the gold. But of course, he had no idea exactly where it had been put, and he couldn't find it. A few years later, somebody, when the house was being rebuilt, one of the builders unearthed a jar full of gold coins. And cutting a long story short, he managed to claim that the treasure trove of what he buried in the garden could be repaid to him and the family. But little did anybody know that there were two jars of gold coins. And it wasn't until another 70 years later that the second jar of coins turned up. And fortunately, somebody had remembered from the case 70 years earlier or so that who the family was, and they were eventually tracked down. Martin's son was tracked down to Jerusalem, where he was living. And another court hearing was held, and the gold was given back to the rightful owners of the family. And they spent quite a lot of the money that they got for the gold on making proper headstones for the family members who'd been lost in internment. So that's the rather remarkable story of Martin Sulzbacher, which I only discovered because I had come across one envelope on eBay with his name on it. So this is a fascination that you can find from looking into the envelopes and the history that's behind them. So the other story I'm going to tell you is of the postmaster of Hay Camp 7 in Australia, Hans Rosenblut. And these are two sketches and cartoons of Hans Rosenblut with his letters doling out the post where he was postmaster. The wonderful thing with Hans is he loved keeping paperwork. He was a camp secretary in Hay, and he kept every form under the sun. And Rachel and I have had the privilege to be able to examine his archive and his letters, which have come up with some very interesting stories. So these are the letters from his interment, which shows that the first letter he posted when he was in Lingfield in Surrey, when he was first interned at the very beginning of July 1940. And he was promptly then put on the Dunera again, leaving on the 10th of July. And a lot of the family didn't know that they would have gone. So the first thing, and you can see here below that, there is a cable and wireless telegram from Hay, New South Wales, Camp 7, where he was able to say that he was where he was, and he asked his family could they send him some money. The envelope below shows this is one that he posted from the camp, and in Australia they were allowed, if they could afford it, from Hay, to send things by airmail. If they were sending things through the normal post on the blank letters that were provided, it would take a good 2.5 months for the letter to arrive. So you can imagine trying to hold a correspondence with somebody back in England was nigh on impossible. However, the cost of sending a letter from Australia back to England by airmail, and this one went via New Zealand and then by clipper flying boat airmail to America and then across the Atlantic to England. Cost £5 shillings and 10 pence, which in those days was a lot of money. So communication was particularly difficult for those who were in Australia. In May 1941, after 9 months at Hay, those who had volunteered to join the Pioneer Corps and returned to England were sent to Tatura Camp 4. And those from Camp 7 were in Section D. So the next letter you can see was from Tatura Camp 4. But as you see, this one doesn't have any stamps on it, and it was posted free of charge, but it was going by surface because the authorities at Tatura Camp in Victoria refused to allow airmail letters unless they were very urgent about release or something very important. So relatively few airmail letters survive from that period. And you can see here, this one, which was sent from that camp, has been stamped approved for transmission by the camp commandant. So any letter that was to be sent by airmail had to be approved. From Tatura Camp 4, they then got transferred because there was no shipping back to the UK, and the Camp 4 was required for another group of internees coming from elsewhere, that they were sent to Loveday in South Australia, Bermuda Camp, in Bermuda, Loveday Camp 10. And once again, airmail letters weren't allowed. However, as one can see from this, he was allowed to send a telegram saying that he was going to be coming home. And the final one is a telegram when he arrived back in Liverpool at the end of 1941. He, along with my father, would have spent one night back at the Huyton internment camp in Liverpool before they were signed up to join the Pioneer Corps. And in this case, he's then sending a telegram to his family to say that he'd arrived safely and was back in England. Now this slide shows, one or two of the artifacts within Hans Rosenblut's collection and archive. And down the left-hand side, there's 3 of the standard letters that were issued when they were first in the camps. Well, when they were first in the camps, they were allowed to actually write their letters on whatever notepaper they could find, and they weren't restricted on how much they could send. But then the rules and regulations came in that they had to use the prisoner of war notepaper, on which there was a maximum of 24 lines, and there were instructions written in both German and Italian, which upset the internees hugely, because that was one of the things that they complained about most, is the fact that their status as civilian internees and refugees from Nazi oppression was misunderstood. And these letter forms just rub salt into the wound. And here you can see that Hans Rosenblut had sent 2 rude messages to the camp commandant, scrawled on these letters that we're not Nazis, but they're victims. We don't want to write on notepaper printed for Nazis and fascists. And Lieutenant Colonel Thane, who was the commandant of the camp, scrawled on one of the letters and sent it back saying, "Powerful interests are at work on your behalf." And in due course, the rules were relaxed, and the information actually putting prisoner of war on them was removed. However, they did still have to use this official paper, because those letters that were being sent by surface mail, because they were being sent by prisoner of war service, were actually free of charge. If they wanted to use any other service like the airmail, they had to pay the exorbitant rates to do so, which most of the internees couldn't afford. But here you can see, because he was the postmaster in the camps, that he's got a record of how many letters were going out each week. And you can see week ending the 20th of January, 906 letters were sent, 34 cables and 118 parcels. What was that? Sorry, I'm lost half my screen here. And you can see the amount of money that was actually being paid on postage there, which, because I've also studied the camp economics and how much they were spending in the camp canteen. Postage was the single largest expense of what was bought in the camps. And there's another list here of the number of letters in and out. So in this archive, there's a great deal of information about how the post office worked and the postage rates and everything else. But that's a very quick half-hour canter through some examples of how interesting internment mail can be. Obviously, I dare say various of you will have mail of your own or examples which can be examined in that way. I mean, I know I've spoken to Diana before, because again I found one of her father's letters actually being sold on eBay, which he had sent from Australia to his sister. You know, how these letters survive and how they get into people's collections, one doesn't really know, because a lot of families obviously keep their mail for themselves. But the one thing I can say about postal history collectors, although I find there's sometimes slight obsession with the different postmarks and their reason for collecting some of these things, slightly obscure. If it wasn't for them, then a lot of this mail and correspondence wouldn't exist. So it wouldn't be available for us to examine and uncover these stories. And so hopefully it'll be some way off, and Rachel and I are still researching it. We are looking to publish a book which will be able to illustrate the story of internment from the early camps, through the deportations or the transfers to the Isle of Man, deportations to Canada and Australia, as you know, a way of making it a readable and interesting description of internment and what happened to predominantly refugees, but as you gather, there are lots of civilian internees who were merchant seamen, or like the diplomats that we saw earlier. There are lots of fascinating stories on internment, and I haven't mentioned the Italians, but it was not just Italians. There were Finns, there were Hungarians, there were Japanese, a few, and all these people have their own interesting and fascinating stories to tell, which can be, some glimpses can be seen through the postal history. So I think I will end there for and see whether anybody has got anything that they would like to ask, or
Yeah, I haven't seen any questions in the chat, but if anybody has a question, why don't you just speak and ask a question.
Okay, I see that Susan Seymour is with us because she had sent a couple of emails. Hello, Susan. Earlier in the week, and your father's experiences, although you haven't got any of his letters, were very, very similar to Hans Rosenblut's. So apart from the fact that he was arrested again in London and then went to Chelsea Barracks and then I believe to Kempton Park Racecourse instead of to Lingfield, he then also went to Camp 7, Tatura Camp 4D, then to Balmira, and returned to the UK on the same boat, which was the SS Ceramic, to join the Pioneer Corps. So hopefully you found that interesting, that those were the sort of letters that he might have sent had he been able to afford the 5 and 10 pence airmail, which most people could not afford. Those that had wealthy families could, but a lot of the youngsters and those that had no means, they were earning about a shilling a day pocket money in the camp. So they might get 5 shillings pocket money a week, and to spend 5 shillings and 10 pence to spend on a letter was a lot of money. So
I see Monica posted something in the chat. Monica, why don't you tell us about what you posted?
With pleasure, yes. No, basically there are all sorts of very interesting Australian connections, and I just wanted to tell you about this event in particular on the 14th of June at 6 p.m. UK time. Somebody called Mary Claire Adams, who's the daughter of somebody who became a very eminent anthropologist and also lawyer in Australia after being on the Dunera and then in Tatura. And I've also recently made contact with a number of Australians with a particular interest in this peculiar history that we're discussing, and we're planning in early October, probably the 1st and the 2nd in the morning UK time, because of that inhospitable time difference between the UK and Australia. But look out for that. It'll be on the Insiders Outsiders Festival.org website. We're planning a whole cluster of events to do particularly with Interment and the Australian experience. And actually there's another event that I'll give you the link to in a minute with a slightly more oblique Dunera link, and that's on the 6th of June as part of the Insiders Outsiders online events program. It's about an extraordinary book called The Passenger. I don't know whether word has got beyond Britain about this. It's a rediscovered book written in the 1930s by somebody called Alexander Ulrich, or Ulrich Alexander Boschwitz, and it's a remarkable book. It's in the Sunday Times top bestseller list at the moment. But the interesting thing is that he actually was deported on the Dunera to Australia, came back and actually met his death because the boat he was coming back from Australia to England on, believe it or not, whose name I can't for the moment remember, was torpedoed. Yes, that's right, absolutely, thanks. And he's in his late 20s. I mean, so it's just again another of these sort of unexpected, crazy, tragic stories. Yeah.
Monica, could you email that to me and I'll share that with our internment?
Yes, what I'll do, I'll also give the link to that event in a minute. I'll do that right now.
Okay, great, thank you.
Could I add something to that?
Sure.
I just got an email from my sister, and about an event next Sunday at 5 p.m. Australian Standard Time, Eastern Standard Time, which is 8 a.m. in the morning here, which might be a bit early, is part of the celebrations of the 80th anniversary of the arrival of the Dunera in Australia. And it's an event called The Bauhaus Comes to the Riverina, Ludwig Hirschfeld Mack, who was in Hay. And
he's fascinating,
and also an architect. And so that's next Sunday, if anyone's interested.
And a toy designer, very interesting. Can you give us the link to that?
Well, what you do is you go to the Facebook page called Friends of the Dunera Boys.
Because there's a Dunera Association, I think, as well, isn't there? I don't know if that's...
Yeah, the Facebook page is run by the Dunera Association.
Yeah, and if you could email that to me at thausner@gmail.com, I'll get that to our Interment group. Great, thank you.
And Monica, I will send you a little essay that I've written about a particular print that Hirschfeld Mack was allegedly produced, which we don't believe he did, which unfortunately is in the book as one of his. But I've done quite a bit of research on some of the art within the Australian camps.
Very good. No, we must have a chat sometimes, Alan, because yes, I'd love to rope you in. Okay, very good.
So what I would like to say is that obviously because of my own initial interest in Australia, I've probably got more interest and expertise or material and expertise on Australia than I do on Canada. And if anybody has got interesting stories of internment in Canada and the different camps and postal history from Canada, I would be quite interested in seeing that, because although I have access to quite a bit of it, I haven't spent my time delving as deep into some of those stories. So that research is ongoing. Rachel, my research on correspondence from the Isle of Man and some of the early UK camps is quite well established, as is Australia. Canada is very much work in process.
I can put you in touch, Alan, with various people in North America who might have some nuggets of information for you on that front. Can I ask a very factual question? What was the time span? I mean, when people were rescued from the Arandora Star and then shipped off on the Dunera, what was how much time elapsed?
8 days.
8 days, incredible, isn't it?
So they were torpedoed on the 2nd of July and the Dunera left on the 10th of July.
Incredible.
So those that were well enough to travel, there were 251 Germans and 200 Italians. And I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, but there was about 70 Germans and I think about 50 Italians who weren't well enough to be put on the Dunera and were re-interned on the Isle of Man or elsewhere in the UK till they were released. Yes, Rachel, you need to unmute if you, yeah.
Yeah, I just have, thank you, Alan. I just sent you a message, but I thought I'd ask the question. When you suddenly find these things on eBay, do you then try and track down any heirs or family in each case, or have you succeeded?
Not in each case. I mean, in the case of Martin Sulzbacher, then yes, we did, because having done a bit of research, we obviously discovered the story of the gold and
yeah, that was in the press, yeah,
because that was in the press, and that then gave us the links to the now. Sometimes, you know, I will spot these things and I will know. So there was one occasion when, yes, I found one from Rudy Moore to his sister, and we'd already been in touch with his daughter Diana, who's listening this evening. So, and
so I was asking about Heinz Bing. Have you got contacts with his family? Because I have contacts with them.
I don't know. I mean, Hans Bing again is another rather tragic story, which again I didn't go into, and has been his diary. I can't remember. Rachel will be able to tell me. Is it at the Imperial War Museum?
Yeah, it's at the Imperial War Museum.
But at some time, his entire collection of envelopes and letters were sold off. And you will find those scattered amongst lots of different collections and lots of different dealers. So you come across his correspondence and letters quite frequently. And he's actually featured, there's another book which is going to be similar in style to what Rachel and I are proposing, but slightly different subject, which is one by Charmian Brinson and William Kaczynski, which is this book here, which is Fleeing the Führer, which again describes refugees' experiences from Nazi Germany, illustrated by the covers. And Bing's story is actually told in there as well. I know I'll say briefly, it's rather sad that he left his fiancée back in England, and most of this correspondence relates to his correspondence with the fiancée. But sadly, she died the day he returned to the UK. I'm not quite sure whether that was from tuberculosis or something else, but it's again rather a tragic tale. And some of the last letters are complaining that she's not responding to his letters, and one can only imagine why. But
he then remarried and had 3 daughters.
Okay.
And that's the family that we were very close to. And it's interesting because I'm actually related to Martin Sulzbacher, and to Walter Seymour on the other side of my family, and we're friends with Heinz Bing. So that's a really good connections there. I can supply you with some information about the daughters, and one of them decided to go to Australia to emigrate. And I'm interested whether that was actually linked to her father's experiences. It could have been, I don't know, but she lives there now.
Yes, so yes, Diana.
Where in Germany did some of the people you've mentioned come from? Where did Martin Sulzberger come?
I would have to look that up. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I can certainly... yeah,
I'm interested if any of them came from Bavaria.
I don't think he did, but I'll look it up.
I think, and Mr. Bing as well.
There was some from Munich.
Bing is definitely a Bavaria. You know, there is definitely a family from Bavaria called Bing.
I
don't need to know now. I just thought I'd. Yeah.
But it's amazing that from one letter that you follow a trail through. I mean, of all the 28,000 or so internees, they all have different stories, and and I won't say anyone is not worth hearing, because they all have their own tales to tell, and I just happened to pick some of the ones that have sort of featured heavily, and yes, there's obviously a great deal of tragedy, because you get internees writing letters home to their wives who are still in Germany, and you get letters coming back from Germany with all the official German stamps on saying, or cachets on saying, gone away, and obviously their wives or family have been deported. Yeah, I mean there are obviously heartwarming stories and as well, and those that internment wasn't a tragedy for everybody. A lot of people, a lot of the youngsters learned a great deal from their time in internment, and it was a great adventure to them, and they saw the world. And my father always said he saw more of Australia than most Australians would have done in several lifetimes, being shipped around. There are different perspectives now on those who understood that Britain had saved them from, or rescued them as refugees from the Nazis, and in the panic that, with impending invasion, did rather silly things like shipping people halfway around the world where it was actually very difficult to get them back. So, there's lots of aspects. And again, reading some of the letters, when you get the privilege to read a lot of the things that are collected by postal historians, you just see the envelopes. But if you're lucky that the letters still survive as well, you will see debates from people out in Australia as to whether they want to risk the return journey to England. And as we heard that there were a couple of boats on the way back from Australia that were torpedoed, with those that were actually below 21, and there was about a third of the Dunera boys were below 21. They actually needed parental permission because they were still under the age of consent, which was 21 at the time, to travel back. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of them stayed in Australia, because they couldn't actually get permission. Their parents didn't want them to risk coming back to war-torn Europe, and thought they were better staying in Australia, whereas they themselves were pleading with their parents saying, please sign the release form so that, or the permission to travel so that we can come home. There are lots and lots of stories that one can understand about internment and hopes and aspirations from within the letters. But one could fill, well, probably 28,000 volumes on each individual case. So everybody has their own story.